When people hear a title like that, they expect a spectacle. They imagine a dramatic confession, a public humiliation, a revenge body, a reinvention stitched together from anger and applause. But the truth is quieter than that. The truth is that nothing in me changed all at once. It changed by repetition, by small permissions, by private habits performed when no one was watching, by the slow education of loneliness. She did leave me for a man with more money, or at least a man whose life looked easier from the outside. I was old enough by then to know that people rarely leave for one reason. They leave for the accumulation of silences, for the fatigue of carrying someone else's uncertainty, for the invisible draft that moves through a home long before the door finally closes. Still, when she was gone, the simplest explanation was the one that stayed in my chest. I had not been enough in the way the world teaches men to be enough. I worked, paid bills, answered texts, nodded through meetings, and performed steadiness like it was a trade. I knew how to be useful. I knew how to be dependable. But usefulness is not the same as ease, and dependability is not the same as being known. Even before the breakup, I had spent years living under a particular kind of pressure. The pressure to be composed, firm, practical, uncomplaining. There was always another version of masculinity waiting to grade me. Earn more. Speak less. Want less. Need nothing.
Carry it.
Swallow it.
Move on.
That way of living can make a room out of a person but not a home. The first phase of my life was boyhood, and in memory it feels like fluorescent lighting, bright enough to see by, harsh enough to hide under. I was a sensitive child who learned early that softness attracted correction. Adults called it shyness when it was really caution. Other boys called it weirdness when it was really attention. I noticed fabrics, voices, posture, the way women around me seemed to communicate care through ritual. A cardigan folded over a chair. Cold cream before bed. Nail polish remover on a cotton pad. Hair brushed out slowly after a long day. None of it looked frivolous to me. It looked like a language of repair. I did not have words for what I felt. I only knew that the world available to men seemed strangely underfurnished. We were allowed hunger, ambition, irritation, and jokes. We were not encouraged toward delicacy unless it could be turned into talent, not tenderness unless it stayed abstract. I remember standing in the hallway as a teenager, listening to my mother move through her bedtime routine in the bathroom, and feeling something I would only later recognize as longing, not to become someone else exactly, but to enter a gentler relationship with myself. At first, private self-expression came in ways so small they barely seemed real. A face cream bought under the excuse of dry skin. Better shampoo. A longer shower after midnight. Fresh sheets on a Wednesday for no reason at all. I discovered that routine could interrupt despair. If the day had treated me like a machine, I could reclaim the night by behaving as though I were worth tending to. That was the beginning of what I would later call the gentle transformation. Not a performance. Not a costume. A mindset. A refusal to handle myself with the same roughness the world preferred. In my 20s, the pressure changed shape, but not intensity. Every room became a ranking system. Career, income, confidence, romantic success, physical presence. Men are told competition makes us sharp. No one mentions how it can also make us lonely. I dated, worked harder, laughed on cue, and kept the softer parts of myself in storage. Some evenings I would come home too drained to think, and yet I would still find energy for one private act of care, moisturizing my hands carefully, choosing sleepwear that felt elegant instead of merely practical, brushing my hair more slowly than necessary, standing differently in the mirror when the apartment was quiet. I did not think of it as transformation then. I thought of it as relief. What made it powerful was not appearance. It was permission. I began to understand that femininity, at least in the way I approached it, was not about imitation or theater. It was about atmosphere, about the emotional architecture of how I moved through private time. Clean surfaces, folded clothes, warm light, a slower pace, a softer inner voice. The world had taught me to treat my body like equipment. These rituals taught me to treat it like a life. After she left, Those routines stopped being occasional and became necessary. The apartment had an echo to it. Even the refrigerator sounded abandoned. I would come home from work and feel the pressure of no witness, no touch, no conversation waiting to absorb the day. That is the kind of loneliness no achievement cancels. It sits beside you while you eat takeout from the container. It follows you to the sink. It lies down with you and names itself practicality, so you don't have to call it grief. That was when I stopped asking whether my private expressions were justified. Justified to whom? The people who would congratulate a man for drinking himself numb but mock him for caring how he folded a satin blouse he wore only in the safety of his own room? The people who believed suffering counted as strength only when it looked ugly enough? No. I had tried surviving the approved way. It had left me hollow and presentable. So I built another way in secret. Not overnight. Not boldly. Gently. Gentleness, I learned, is easiest to dismiss when you have never needed it. In the months after the breakup, my life became painfully efficient. I woke up early, answered emails, performed competence, came home, ate something forgettable, and tried not to think too hard between sunset and sleep. On paper, I was functioning. In private, I felt like a hallway with all the doors shut. That was the second phase of my life. Adulthood as endurance. Not crisis, not collapse. Just the long, respectable ache of living without softness. The gentle transformation began to take shape because I needed a structure for surviving evenings. If I let the hours stay empty, my mind would fill them with comparison. Her new life. My old mistakes. My stagnant career. The humiliating feeling that I had been measured and gently declined. So instead of spiraling, I started creating rituals. At first, I did not even recognize them as a philosophy. I only knew they worked. I would wash my face the moment I came home, as if I were rinsing off the emotional residue of the office. I would change out of my work clothes with intention, not by tossing them aside, but by hanging them carefully, as though even my exhaustion deserved order. Then I would choose something private and soft to wear, not for display, not for fantasy, but for emotional alignment. A loose blouse. A skirt that changed the way I stood and sat. Hosiery that made me move with awareness instead of aggression. Each choice altered my pace. Each layer told my nervous system that the hardest part of the day was over. That is what many people misunderstand. They imagine transformation as spectacle, but my experience of it was deeply domestic. It happened in the way I lit the room, in the lotion I applied to my arms without rushing. In the way I learned to sit with my knees together not because I had to but because it changed the emotional weather inside me. Deliberate movements created deliberate thoughts. Careful behavior produced calmer feeling. My body was teaching my mind a language I had been denied. There were no dramatic turning points, only recognitions. I recognized how much of my natural masculinity had been performance under pressure. I recognized how often I had used bluntness on myself in the name of discipline. I recognized that loneliness becomes more dangerous when you have no rituals to hold it. Most of all, I recognized that private femininity, for me, was not about becoming a different person. It was about recovering the dimensions of myself that had been pushed underground because they were inconvenient to the role I had been assigned. As a boy, softness had been corrected. As a young man, it had been postponed. As an adult living alone, it became medicinal. I started buying things slowly. Not excessively, not impulsively. One item at a time, chosen with care. A better nightgown, a silk scarf, a drawer organizer, a perfume so light it felt like memory rather than announcement. I would hold these things in my hands and feel something I had never associated with shopping before. Dignity. Not because the objects were glamorous, but because they expressed a standard. They told me my private life did not have to look neglected just because no one else was invited to witness it. Pressure was still there, of course. Pressure from work. Pressure from age. Pressure from watching peers post promotions, weddings, babies, vacations, kitchens with stone countertops and natural light. The modern world has found efficient ways to monetize insecurity. Every scroll suggests a superior version of your life is available if only you could optimize harder. In that atmosphere, my nightly transformation became a quiet refusal. I was not optimizing. I was tending. I was not performing for an audience. I was restoring contact with myself. Some nights, I would stand before the mirror and do almost nothing except observe. No dramatic makeup, no elaborate styling. Just a softer expression, better posture, a face no longer clenched against the day. I would notice how different I looked when I stopped bracing. The more I practiced, the more I understood that behavior shapes identity. If I handled myself with patience, I became more patient. If I dressed with grace, I behaved more gracefully. If I made room for vulnerability, it stopped arriving as panic. This was not escapism in the shallow sense people accuse it of being. Escapism implies avoidance. What I was doing was closer to translation. I was taking emotional needs I could not satisfy in the ordinary language of manhood and expressing them in a more livable dialect. Care, beauty, routine, privacy, gentleness, delicacy, without shame. These were not luxuries. They were survival tools. I kept all of this hidden for a long time, and secrecy has a cost even when the secret saves you. There is a strain in having a private life that feels truer than your public one. At work I was measured, capable, dryly funny, good in meetings. At home I became quieter, kinder, more receptive, more emotionally precise. I began journaling in the voice I found easiest to inhabit during those evenings, not a different identity exactly, but a different register of honesty. The pages were less defensive. They contained fewer arguments and more observations. I wrote about how exhaustion feels in the shoulders, about how certain fabrics slow breathing, about the loneliness of making dinner for one, about the strange relief of learning that self-respect can be practiced physically. What surprised me most was how this mindset improved the rest of my life. I became less brittle with coworkers, less needy in dating, less hungry for validation from people who did not know how to give it. When you build a private ritual of care, the world loses some of its monopoly on soothing you. That does not erase loneliness, but it makes loneliness less lawless. I was no longer waiting for someone else to authorize my peace. I was learning how to furnish it myself. The third phase of life was not youth, and it was not heartbreak. It was maintenance. No one tells you how much adulthood is really about maintenance. Maintaining income, health, composure, boundaries, and the illusion that all of this comes naturally. There were years when my life did not look tragic enough to justify how tired I felt. I had work. I had an apartment. I had people who texted me on holidays and remembered my birthday. Nothing was visibly broken, and yet so much of my inner life seemed to depend on whether I could make it home before becoming numb. That was when the gentle transformation stopped feeling like a secret hobby and started becoming a moral framework. Not moral in the public sense, not about rules or righteousness. Moral in the private sense of asking, how should a person treat a life entrusted to his care? I had spent so many years disciplining myself through criticism that kindness felt almost suspicious. If I was tired, I pushed. If I was lonely, I distracted myself. If I was anxious, I called it productivity and kept moving. The transformation mindset interrupted that cycle. It asked me to respond with intentional behavior instead of reflex. Some evenings the ritual was simple. I would prepare tea, tidy the room, shower slowly, and dress in a way that made me feel composed rather than depleted. Other nights it extended further. Light makeup, careful grooming, a little jewelry chosen not for effect but for coherence. A bracelet could remind me to use my hands more gently. A skirt could remind me not to stomp through the apartment as if I were late for my own life. Lip color, even when subtle, could make me speak less harshly to myself because suddenly the mouth delivering the criticism looked like it deserved better words. People who have never needed behavior to reshape feeling may not understand how profound that can be. They think expression follows identity. Often it does. But sometimes identity has to be coaxed into visibility through expression repeated over time. I did not wake up one day at peace. I rehearsed peace through routine until my nervous system believed it was allowed to stay. Memory played a peculiar role in all of this. The older I got, the more clearly I saw the scattered clues from earlier years. The long stare at department store mannequins, not out of desire, but recognition. The envy I felt toward women whose self-presentation seemed to include permission for emotional complexity. The relief of being alone in hotel rooms during work travel, where I could wash, moisturize, groom, and dress without feeling observed by the expectations attached to my name. These memories stopped embarrassing me once I understood them as continuity instead of evidence against myself. Continuity matters. So much suffering comes from believing your private patterns are random defects rather than messages repeated across time. Once I saw the thread, I stopped fighting it. I was not inventing a self in middle age because I had been rejected. I was finally listening to a self that had been whispering through every stage of my life. The breakup, in retrospect, had only removed the last excuse. As long as I was partnered, I could pretend that compromise required postponement. I could tell myself I was protecting the relationship, keeping things simple, avoiding unnecessary difficulty. After she left, simplicity lost its moral glow. I had already simplified myself into loneliness. Why keep doing it? So my evenings became more exact, more beautiful, and more honest. I learned which colors calmed me, which fabrics made me feel sheltered, which postures opened the chest instead of collapsing it. I learned that care is cumulative. A polished nail buffed clear instead of colored. Legs moisturized after shaving, not because someone might see them, but because I would. A brushed wig set properly on its stand like respect for a tomorrow version of me. Laundry folded with attention. Drawers arranged. Shoes lined up. The room itself became part of the transformation, because an environment can either confirm your worth or quietly argue against it. And yes, there were lonely nights still. Nights when routine could not fully dissolve the ache of being unwitnessed. But even then, the mindset helped. Loneliness is cruelest when it convinces you that neglect is realism. The gentle transformation refused that premise. It said, even alone, especially alone, your life deserves ceremony, not extravagance.
Ceremony.
The kind that says this hour counts, this body counts, this feeling counts. Over time, the private care changed the public man. I became less interested in proving masculinity because I no longer believed masculinity was the only frame sturdy enough to hold me. I softened in conversation. I listened better. I stopped chasing relationships where my tenderness would have to be translated into jokes to survive. I became harder to impress and easier to soothe. That may sound small, but it altered the quality of my days. The viral part of my story, if it deserves the word, did not arrive through exhibitionism. It came through language. One late night, after finishing my routine, I wrote a short reflection online about private rituals, emotional survival, and the dignity of caring for oneself in ways the world might not understand. I did not name everything. I did not offer spectacle. I simply wrote the truth carefully. I wrote that some transformations are not about changing who you are, but about changing the tone in which you inhabit yourself. I wrote that softness can be a survival skill. I wrote that routine can become a form of mercy. I posted it without much thought and went to bed. By morning, it had traveled farther than anything I had ever made. Viral is a strange word. It suggests speed, contagion, loss of control. In reality, what happened felt slower and more intimate than that, even as the numbers rose. Messages came in from people I had never met, men, women, people in between and beyond those words, all saying some version of the same thing. I thought I was the only one. I thought my private rituals were silly. I thought I was weak for needing gentleness. I thought survival had to look harder than this. That was when I understood that the post had not spread because it was sensational. It spread because it was familiar. Not the particulars, perhaps, but the hunger underneath them. The hunger to live in a less punishing relationship with oneself. I did not suddenly become public in the dramatic sense. I was careful. I protected my job, my name, my ordinary life. But I wrote more. Quietly at first, then with greater confidence. Essays about care as structure. About solitude and self-presentation. About the hidden emotional labor of masculinity and the ways some of us smuggle softness into our lives through routine because open permission never arrived. I wrote about cross-dressing, not as shock, rebellion, or fantasy, but as one valid language among many for private coherence. A way of behaving toward the self that can restore dignity when the outer world has become overly sharp. The responses kept coming, and with them came another phase of memory. I remembered how often I had mocked my own needs before anyone else could. How many years I had spent pre-rejecting myself. That habit is one of the deepest wounds pressure creates. We learn to edit ourselves in advance, to become our own hecklers, to call our longing indulgence and our tenderness weakness before anyone else gets the chance. The gentle transformation had not only changed my evenings, it had slowly disarmed that internal cruelty. There is a particular peace in no longer arguing with your own patterns. I do not mean that every question was resolved. Life remained complicated. Work still stressed me. Bills still arrived. Some family members would never understand the full shape of me, and some friends knew only the version of me that had been optimized for daylight. But inner peace does not require universal translation. It requires a stable treaty with yourself. Mine was built through repetition. The same mirror, the same lamp, the same patient gestures night after night. Remove the day. Clean the skin. Choose softness. Slow the body. Lower the voice. Let private elegance replace public abrasion. These actions accumulated meaning because they accumulated trust. My mind began to believe that home was not merely where I lived. Home was the state I could enter when I treated myself with care. Sometimes I think about the man she left. The richer man. The easier man. For years I used him as a symbol of what I lacked. Money, certainty, the polished edges of conventional success. But time has a way of exposing false comparisons. Maybe he gave her a life that suited her. Maybe he was kinder than I imagined. None of that matters now. The important thing is this: being left forced me to stop bargaining with my own survival. It forced me to admit that if my life was going to feel inhabitable, I would have to make it so myself. And that is what the transformation really was. Not revenge. Not replacement. Not disguise. A method of inhabiting myself with enough grace that I no longer needed pain to prove I was serious. In writing publicly, I also discovered responsibility. When people feel seen by your words, you owe them honesty. So, I resisted the urge to romanticize loneliness. Loneliness is not beautiful. It is repetitive, dull, embarrassing, and physically tiring. It makes dinner smaller. It makes weekends slippery. It makes ordinary chores feel heavier because there is no witness to completion. But private self-expression can soften its edges. Routine can interrupt despair. Beauty, however modest, can return proportion to a life that has become all burden. That is not vanity. It is maintenance of the soul. The more I wrote, the clearer my own understanding became. Cross-dressing, for me, was never a departure from adulthood. It was one of the ways I learned to do adulthood without disappearing inside it. It gave structure to evenings when silence threatened to become self-neglect. It gave me a practice of observation, restraint, and tenderness. It turned self-care from a slogan into choreography. Wash, fold, smooth, button, brush, breathe. A private sequence through which I could become emotionally legible to myself again. And perhaps that is why the story resonated. Not because everyone shares the same expression, but because many people know what it is to create a secret method of survival. A playlist, a walk, a skincare routine, a notebook, a prayer, a perfectly made bed in an otherwise chaotic season. We build little ceremonies because ordinary life can be brutal in ways too minor to earn sympathy and too constant to ignore. By then, I no longer needed the post's popularity to validate me. The irony was almost tender. The transformation had gone viral only after it had already done its real work in private. Public recognition was an echo, not a cause. The peace came first in the smallest room of my apartment, under warm light, with clean hands and a quieter heart. I am older now, and memory has lost some of its sharpness, while keeping its truth. When I look back across the phases of my life, I do not see a neat narrative. I see pressure changing outfits. Childhood pressure to toughen. Young adult pressure to compete. romantic pressure to simplify myself for love, professional pressure to remain efficient, unemotional, easy to file under, reliable. Each stage taught me something useful, but each stage also tried, in its own way, to narrow me. The gentle transformation developed because narrowing may help a person function, but it does not help a person breathe. There is peace in admitting that survival often begins with very unglamorous acts. Hanging up clothes. Replacing worn sleepwear with something that feels intentional. Cleaning the bathroom sink because your future self deserves to walk into order. Learning which gestures calm the mind. Learning that how you dress in private can influence how gently you think. Learning that softness is not the opposite of seriousness. Sometimes it is the only thing making seriousness bearable. I no longer divide myself as harshly as I once did. Public and private are still different, but they are no longer enemies. The man who handles meetings, budgets, obligations, and practical life is real. So is the quieter self who understands emotional survival through beauty, routine, and feminine care. They are not competing versions. They are collaborators. One keeps the lights on. The other makes the light livable. If I have gained any wisdom worth passing on, it is this. Identity does not always arrive as revelation. Sometimes it arrives as relief. Sometimes you discover yourself not in the fireworks of certainty, but in the absence of strain. In the moment you realize you have stopped clenching. In the evening you notice your thoughts have become kinder because your surroundings have. In the repeated experience of coming home to yourself instead of abandoning yourself at the door. The title of my story still makes people smile in that curious, internet-trained way. She left me for a rich man, then my transformation went viral. It sounds like comeuppance. It sounds like a plot. But my life was never redeemed by visibility. It was redeemed by practice, by the decision, made over and over, to meet loneliness with care instead of contempt, to answer pressure with refinement instead of collapse. To build a private world so emotionally coherent that I could rest inside it without apology. I think that is why I feel no bitterness now when I remember her. She was not the villain of my life. She was a turning point only because her leaving removed the last distraction from a conversation I had been postponing with myself for decades. Would I continue living in a way that made me externally acceptable and internally absent? Or would I permit a gentler form of selfhood to become real through behavior, routine, and attention? I chose gentleness, though at first it felt less like a choice than surrender. Surrender to what had always been true, that I needed beauty to stay emotionally organized, that I needed rituals of care to keep from becoming numb, that some part of me understood femininity not as spectacle, but as method, a method of tenderness, composure, and mindful presence. Once I stopped fighting that, life became quieter. Not easier in every circumstance, but clearer. These days, my evenings are simple. I come home. I wash away the day. I change with intention. I restore order where I can. Sometimes I dress softly, elegantly, privately. Sometimes I only light a lamp, make tea, and sit in the calm I have spent years learning how to create. The point is no longer the outfit, or the mirror, or even the transformation. The point is the relationship. I know how to be with myself now, and that has turned out to be a kind of wealth no one can leave with. I used to think peace would feel triumphant, like winning an argument or proving something to the world. Instead, peace feels domestic. It feels like folded fabric, like clean skin, like the quiet click of a drawer closing, like not rushing, like no longer needing to insult yourself into motion, like understanding that private self-expression can be sacred even when no one applauds it. If my story offers anything, I hope it offers permission. Permission to recognize the forms of care that keep you whole. Permission to stop measuring your healing by how conventional it looks. Permission to build a life that does not punish you for needing softness. Whatever names other people might choose, whatever conclusions they might jump to, the truth is often much more human than spectacle allows. I survived by becoming gentler with myself, then gentler still. And in that slow, private, careful transformation, I did not lose my life. I finally entered it,